Good morning, everybody, and I'm really nice to be with you. It's really nice here this morning. I just check the technology. Yeah. So I will go on what old Christina has presented, also to show you the challenges, because we have great impact, but we also face challenges, obviously, when we try to develop all these tools and implement them. So you have seen that child, and when I was last week in Rwanda discussing with Ministry of Health, what they really tell us is, yes, we have done great progresses. The child mortality 20 years ago was about 1 to 6, up to the age of 5, and now we are around 1 to 25. But you know, they were really telling us this is not enough. We have a long way in front of us, because in your country, it's 1 among 250, so 10 times lower mortality rate for children. So that's what we want to reach. So e-health, I mean, all health are almost becoming e-health nowadays. And WHO has tried to make a bit of sense of all these technologies, and to say there are 12 domains, and the one we speak about now is the electronic decision support. But obviously, this is closely linked to other areas of e-health, like data collection and reporting. We have to connect now to electronic health records, a big challenge in these countries. And also, we use this point-of-care test that Christina showed you before. So what is existing in terms of this decision support tool? Is it really new? In fact, you see that there was a scientist in the Lancet saying the times have passed that a single human mind could even pretend to know all that might be useful in aiding patients. But this was back in '64 already. So you see, it's nothing new. And the first big decision support tool for cancer was developed by IBM, Dr. Watson. So it took a long time, you know, to go there. But now it's exploding, and if you go on the Play Store, you can find all kinds of tools to do self-diagnosis or to guide clinicians. So I will show you 3 examples of them. So you type symptom checker, you can see that there are many around. And these are the most popular one, the Babylon. And you have also another one called Ada, and a third one I will show you, Isabel. So I took the case of my daughter, who is 16 years of age, and she had some fever, vomiting, headache, and she really didn't feel well. So I entered her case in the system. So in Babylon, what I get is that she had migraine or flu and other type of diseases, and they claim that they are the biggest disruption of general practice in years. You enter exactly the same case in ADA, and what you get now is a bit different, a longer list: flu, trench fever, rickettsiosis, sepsis, viral meningitis, and you are supposed to, for the first one, stay at home, second one, seek advice, and the third one, run to the emergency room. So you think, okay, which of these 3 advice am I now supposed to follow? And then you put it in Isabel, and you saw it's a long list of possibilities up to, I mean, what will worry all patients, obviously Lyme disease and all these kind of things. So obviously all infectious diseases are there almost. So this is the output for the same clinical case. But what is more worrying is really what is going on with these tools in terms of validation. So Babylon, we had a contract signed first with NIH to have every patient using the tool before going to the GP. And then, I cannot read very well, it's a bit far, I will do like that. So they were saying we are one of the safest primary care provider of UK. But then a few GPs brought complaints. They said, your tool is not even able to diagnose infarction in a man of 60 years of age that is smoking. So there must be a problem somewhere. So Babylon answered in the press, some would like to see us fail and use anonymous and wrong allegations. Some even pretend to be physicians, but they were real physicians, in fact. So somebody said, yes, we have to go to the commission, check the quality of this tool, and the conclusion was some areas Babylon is not safe. but the report was censored by the High Court upon request from Babylon. And then they ran to do quickly a validation in terms of medical device certification, but level 1, it's the lowest level, so this is auto-certification. You don't need to provide any data. In fact, this tool should go to class 2B, probably, in terms of safety. Finally, the researcher came in and wrote a letter in the BMG saying, could Babylon please supply evidence? So they created a few clinical cases, well-targeted, and their conclusion was that Babylon do better diagnosis than human beings, with 50 case scenarios, but that was not peer-reviewed. That was analyzed again by scientists who wrote a letter in the Lancet, serious methodological problem in this study. And in the meantime, 2.5 million people in UK, Rwanda, and Ireland are using Babylon. In fact, I was in Rwanda and I saw the poster of Babylon on all health facilities. I started to ask a bit, what are people, how are they using this tool? In fact, they completely removed the algorithm from the tool and they kept only telemedicine, probably because the government intervened and said, no, this is not safe enough. Telemedicine you can do, but not more. But you see, in our countries, there is no mechanism to stop that. And in one evaluation in 2015 of this kind of tools, the conclusion was that 51% of actual diagnoses were among the 3 top diagnoses provided by the algorithm. So this is really a challenge, and there is a mathematician in the UK that said, really, we need an FDA for algorithms. We cannot continue like that. We need a mechanism to ensure safety for patients. So the question is really, what type of algorithm do we need for what type of people? So what do patients really need when they do self-diagnosis at home? Here you have a very simple and nice tool developed by the family practitioner of Netherlands that exactly for my daughter was saying, you don't have to go to a physician, you just need to stay in bed, avoid physical effort, don't stay in the sun, drink a lot, and take paracetamol, and this will calculate your dose of paracetamol. So this is very simple. This is what we can afford to do for patients. In fact, my daughter had a heat stroke, but this never came up in none of the apps. It's not easy to diagnose. On the other range, we have specialized physicians. In fact, we have been in travel medicine using Gideon for many years. That gives also long list of possibilities with, let's say, probabilities that are not very reliable, but at least for the end of the list for rare disease in remote places, this helps us to remind if we have forgotten any possibility. But for frontline physician and clinician, as Christina mentioned, what they really need is to decide first, should I refer the patient or admit at hospital? Which of the lab tests am I supposed to use in this jungle? You know, it's more and more tests are available for the same disease. And what is the meaning of the result of this test in the clinical context? What specific treatment do I need to give? So when we develop this algorithm, the first step is to define the target user and patient. So for the patient, we restrict to a subgroup. So we started 15 years ago with travel or migrant upon return from the tropics with fever. This is very defined, and we say this does not apply to immunocompromised patients, to pregnant women, etc., which is not the case for the tools I showed you before that pretend to cover whole medicine, any patient of any age. So we did also the same for the South. So this is the tool that Christina presented to you. We had several generations of this algorithm targeting children 2 months to 5 years with history of fever or high temperature, so well defined. And then you have to define for which level of the healthcare you want to develop your algorithm. So we have been developing one version for the community health worker that is clearly different from the one for the primary care level, and obviously physician, because they have different knowledge, but also the profile of the patient they are seeing, they are much more severe. They really need another type of algorithm. And the problem that there are mixture and ADA in this tool are pretending to be also useful for health professionals, but this is completely different and should not be mixed up. Then the next step is the literature review, the one that Christina did for EPOCT. You saw it's endless. It takes a lot of time, a lot of work, and there is some disappointment at the end because the evidence is not much. That's why we have to do our own studies to generate evidence to create this algorithm. So this was a study on etiologies of fever in Tanzania. So we have at least the pre-test probability for each disease. And we did the same. So this is Noemi Boya, who did this work in Tanzania. She's somewhere in the room, yes? So she looked at, no, in fact, this is the next one, Noemi. This is another one on febrile adults travelers. So for the guidelines for travelers, we also looked at a prevalence of diseases in travelers. Next step is to look at clinical predictors. So we do classification and regression tree analysis to see if we can predict, for example, typhoid, because we have not really a good point of care test for typhoid. But here again, you see that the sensitivity is really not enough. So we hope that one day we have a test. In the meantime, we use the CRP. And this is also the biomarkers that Christina mentioned. So we did analysis to check on novel biomarkers that could do better than CRP. And you can see that She3L1 would be quite good to predict radiological pneumonia. Still, this is not exactly bacterial pneumonia. But She3L1 is not available yet as a point-of-care test. And this is the work done by Noemi in febrile Tanzanian adults, where you see that STREM1 could be a good predictor of mortality and could be used as point-of-care test to complement our algorithms. And then you have this headache of transforming all this knowledge in a really logical system of yes and no, and this is the simplest algorithm developed for the community health worker. And here starts the discussion with the IT team, and the problem is that we really don't speak the same language. So now we have several physicians in our group who understand both sides, you know. And to help them, we have developed a platform that is called MedALC. It's really a software where physicians can create their algorithm by drag and dropping the boxes. So you create your variables, and then you move them in the system, and you create your algorithm, and this is immediately converted in an app for health worker. So this is applicable to any type of consultation, both north or southern country, as long as it is an acute problem that you want to deal with the patient. So here is the sort of validation step we have been thinking about with Christina, similar to medicines and vaccine, where phase one will be validity and user-friendliness in the IT lab. And most tools, for now, they stop here. They don't go further in the validation cycle. Because the next step is already a lot of work, as you have seen before. Safety and efficacy immediately means clinical outcome, and you have to follow patients and see what happens to them. And in fact, there is now a new law in Europe that was created in 2017 and is enforced right now, spring of 2020. So this will make a lot of work and changes in this world, because probably bad apps will go away because they will have to prove now that there is some benefits for the patient and especially no risk. And it's true that in the public sector, at universities, we have the luxury of having time, we have funding, we do research, we can afford to do that. But you can imagine that a small startup that brings a new tool has not 20 years or 15 years like we have to validate tools. So this is really a challenge. So this is the result from the study of Christina, the impact of implementing EPOCT compared to routine care or our first generation algorithm that was called Almanac, closer to IMCI. And this is the way we present it to health authorities in Tanzania, in Rwanda, to convince them to implement these tools at larger scale. You see the cure rate improved from 95 to 98%. This is not a lot. This is primary care. Most of them, they just do fine. But at the scale of a country like Tanzania, this is still 1 million clinical failure averted per year. So this is quite of interest for them, but what they are even more interested in is this saving of medicines, not so much because of antibiotic pressure, but just about cost. So this is a good way to convince them quickly from 95% to 11% with EPOCT, and shifting also antibiotics to the more severe group. So this, at the scale of Tanzania, would represent 28 million of unnecessary antibiotic saved per year. So we have to go further in this validation step. It's in fact back and forth that we do that. And now we will try for the first time to go at a larger scale, doing more effectiveness, impact, and use the generated data to adapt it in the algorithm for time and place. Because like Annie is our specialist in machine learning and also physician who is working in our team, she always say, I mean, you cannot deploy a fixed algorithm that doesn't move in a changing environment. So it's much more ethical to have this algorithm following up what is going around. But obviously, it becomes very difficult to assess it in a purely randomized controlled trial. You need to have more an adaptive design to do that. And you have to take into account also users and do qualitative studies to know how to best implement your tool. So the dynamic project that is supported by Fondation Bortna and SDC will be implemented in Tanzania and Rwanda. So first extending the content of the EPOCT tool, as Christina mentioned, to include up to 14 years of age and neonates. And we have developed a new software that has a more user-friendly interface, because what we found and had used previously was not really good for health workers. So with this tool, we will go in around 150 health facilities in low and high endemic areas in Tanzania and Rwanda. Low and high endemic areas for malaria, because there is an interference between CRP and malaria, because CRP is used to predict bacterial disease, but is also going up when you have malaria. So we will have around 1 million consultations with sick children over 2 years, which means that this is still not at all big data, according to the definition, but this is for us at least quite a lot of data, and will allow us to have more variability of groups. So we start to be able to look at the subgroup of HIV-positive children and maybe tailor the algorithm for these particular children. And we will also do machine learning and optimization in collaboration with OPFL, Dr. Siagi's lab, with Annie leading that. So Annie can explain much better than me. But the idea is really to use machine learning to optimize the feature that we collect, because this clinician have only 10 minutes to do a consultation, so we can find out which are the really important feature that makes the difference for the diagnosis. We have to deal also with systematic missing data, because we follow a certain path. So you have always the missing data, the same one coming up. So how to get more information around that? Obviously, improve the prediction, the accuracy of the algorithm, and look for patterns to be able maybe to detect epidemics, at least do disease surveillance with health authorities. So obviously they are very interested about this part also. But machine learning will never be used to automatically change the algorithm. We will always have a physician, or this group of experts in Tanzania, approving the change, because we really think that it's too dangerous to have an automated system, or at least it has to be done in very, very clear boundaries. So now one problem we are facing is that we implement tons and tons of tablets and computers, and the half-life of this material nowadays is about 2 years. So I was evaluating a program in Burkina Faso. There are hundreds of health workers, 270 facilities. After 2 years, they have to change all the tablets because they were not working anymore. So you can imagine the waste that this produces in these countries. So we need a fair phone or a fair tablet, and I called the WHO the digital health department to ask them, did you ever think about that? Because we have to do something. Can we connect the Fairphone group in Netherlands to be producing a Fair tablet for Africa? And they said, wow, that's interesting. We have never really thought about this problem. And the other big problem is all this data we generate, because you know that servers in the Silicon Valley or elsewhere are extremely high consuming energy. So for the climate, this is a disaster, and we should really not store useless data on long term. We have to do cleaning of everything so that we only keep what is really useful and necessary to our patients. Because in fact, digital technologies are really a limited resources. You see that the electricity that is needed for maintaining data center will explode in the coming years, while we have exactly a huge problem of electricity creation. So how will we do that? And the impact of greenhouse gas emissions is also enormous. We are reaching 10% of emissions are due to digital tools. So this is really a problem. We have to think in terms of sustainability, and we will do a full ecological evaluation of our project to see what we can do to mitigate that. And another problem is that the raw material needed to create tablets will end up in about 10 to 15 years. So it means in 10 or 15 years, we have no more raw material to create all what we have. So what will we do? And I think we really have to anticipate that and create tools that allow clinicians to learn, not to become stupid, not having a black box, but really taking this opportunity to learn so that the day when there is no more tablet, they can still manage their patients. And we will face a big society problem where we will have to choose, because there will be limited number of tablets and computers or data. So who will have the right? Is it runners in Switzerland, healthy, or a small child in Africa? This will be extremely difficult ethical problems we will face. But in the meantime, health workers, they are really demanding this tool. This was a qualitative study in Burkina Faso. You see that they were saying it increases knowledge. If you record in the REC, this is the tool used by Terre des Hommes in Burkina Faso, you learn at the same time. If one day there is no tablet, you will still be able to correctly manage the child. That was an accoucheuse who was saying that in a small village. So that means she learns by heart. It's very visual with the tablet. And when there is no electricity, she still remembers what is the next screen that is supposed to come for a certain patient. So there is a learning process. This is very reassuring. It gives self-confidence. Yes, it teaches us, as you cannot retain everything in your head, but with the REC, it reminds you at any time you have in front of you, and it allows you to master. So they felt very proud in front of the clinician, much more than when they had a paper-based IMCI flip chart that makes them feel they don't know their job. In fact, it improves communication. That's also a worry when you bring a lot of technology in this interaction between patient and clinician. And this is the head of the village who was saying, now clinicians ask us more questions on the child and touch him more. So that means they are doing a physical examination that they were basically not doing before. It brings transparency. So that was the old people in the village saying, in French, on était dans les ténèbres, maintenant on est dans la lumière. We don't know exactly what it means, but it's something around, the tablets shows clearly that there is no need for an antibiotic, so they cannot really, force us to buy it and make a bit of money at the same time. So they had this feeling of transparency, because as soon as you have data, you can see everything. And in fact, it really changes the power balance. This is our colleagues in the economical department in University of Lausanne concluding that each technological innovation is double-sided, not due to the good or bad way of using it, but due to the change in the distribution of power. It removes power for some to give it to others, changing the reality for all. And that's really what we see. There is a bit less power on the physician side and a bit more power on the patient side. And that, I think, is really important. And it's clear that it brings back pride and autonomy for these people in the remote villages. So I think we should really keep them in our mind when we have to decide who has the right in the future to use this tool with the problem of the climate change. So I really invite you to join us. Health workers are in the street protesting against the government in UK and now also in southern Switzerland. So you are welcome in the north to do the same. We have to do something. Otherwise, we will lose all the benefits we have gained on these children in the south. And this is already starting. Malnutrition is going up again. And all our effort will be lost if we don't do something about the climate. Thank you very much.